Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson on a warm, cloudy evening that should have been ordinary. The pilots who signed out of Concourse E were talking about crosswinds and ground delays, and a ramp agent was arguing about tow bar inventory near gate E17. I remember the way the airport smelled that day: disinfectant, coffee, and the faint rubber of moving walkways. I had finished a double shift at a downtown urgent care and took an extra emergency physician slot at the airport clinic because they needed coverage for a surge of travelers. The message from hospital administration was blunt and careful at the same time. Respiratory cases in Atlanta were increasing, but services were stable. The words were chosen to calm. The tone told a different story. I checked in with the airport medical supervisor, a former trauma nurse named Angela who had run mass casualty drills here for years. She handed me a radio and a bright orange vest that said Medical E Concourse. She pointed at a clipboard with color-coded triage tags and a laminated sheet listing contact numbers: CDC Airport Liaison, TSA Shift Lead, Delta Station Manager, Airport Operations, and the Georgia National Guard Liaison who had been in the loop since morning. Angela's eyes were steady, her hands less so. She asked me to review our airway cart, portable monitors, and the stock of personal protective equipment. On a folding table against the wall sat cases of N95 respirators, powered air-purifying respirators with hoods and full-face shields. The unopened plastic looked freshly delivered. I noticed the dates on the HEPA filters printed on the boxes this gear had been rushed in. By the time a Delta inbound from Miami called short final, we had received 3 calls from gate agents about passengers with fever, confusion, and agitation. The description was familiar to anyone who had worked triage during respiratory seasons, but the frequency was not. I went to E26 with a small team, 1 paramedic, 2 EMTs, and a CDC field officer with a clipboard and a rolling case. The officer introduced himself as Reyes and kept saying, "We're here to support you," which is what people say when no one is sure what comes next. We established the usual layout: a clean zone where we could stage supplies, a buffer with a single entry point, and a hot zone where we would evaluate any sick passengers still on the jet bridge. 2 portable HEPA units were rolled into place, power cords stretched to a service outlet, and a temporary negative pressure vestibule went up with clear plastic curtains and magnet seals. It was a system I had used in hospital hallways during outbreaks. Here it felt improvised and precise at the same time. The Miami flight docked, and the door opened to the smell of recycled cabin air and panic that wasn't yet loud. Flight attendants had done their best to separate the sick into the last 6 rows. We moved the stable passengers out first. A young woman with a rolling carry-on asked whether her grandmother could get a wheelchair. A man in a suit wanted to know if the lounge was open. 2 teenagers asked if this was going to be on the news. I spoke softly and kept my answers short. When you cannot give certainty, you give structure. I reminded myself of that with every instruction I voiced. The first patient from the back of the aircraft was a middle-aged man with flushed skin and a rapid, shallow breathing pattern. He focused poorly, his eyes not tracking. A flight attendant mentioned he had been disoriented since an hour after takeoff and had tried to wander toward the galley. He looked like severe influenza with delirium, which I had seen many times, but his hands trembled in a way I could not place. We set him in a chair just inside the plastic vestibule, clipped a pulse oximeter to his finger, and attached a blood pressure cuff. His heart rate was high. His oxygen saturation hovered in the low 90s on room air. His temperature was above 102 Fahrenheit. I ordered oxygen through a portable tank with a simple face mask. He stared at me as if he recognized me and then failed to find a word. He reached for my sleeve and tugged once, hard, then released again. The movement was quick and uncoordinated, like a reflex without thought behind it. 2 more patients followed, both febrile, both confused, both showing a rigid, almost postural pattern of movement. The paramedic, Miller, glanced at me over his mask while he wrapped a pressure cuff around a woman's arm. We had handled agitation before. This was different in its sameness. I asked for a line to the CDC liaison and gave a brief report. Reyes was calm and deliberate, took notes, and told me another team was setting up secondary screening near the customs corridor to handle an incoming flight from Houston. We spent the next hour progressing through a checklist that felt like a script. The airport clinic sent stretchers. TSA officers helped maintain a cordon around the gate area to keep onlookers back. People watched from behind the rope, phones out, asking questions we could not answer. I heard the first raised voice when a passenger demanded to pass through and return to his connection on Concourse B. The TSA lead, a woman named Monroe, explained that the gate was temporarily closed for medical screening. She repeated the same sentence 3 times, each time more slowly. She had the patient calm of someone accustomed to repeating rules to people in a hurry. The pattern shifted when a cabin crew member from the Miami flight started to sway and then caught herself on the beverage cart. She insisted she was fine. I brought her into the buffer area and took her vitals. She was sweating through her uniform. Her pulse was rapid, over 120. Her temperature was climbing. Her eyes kept moving with a small horizontal nystagmus when she tried to fix on my face. She asked to sit down and then slid to the floor before we could arrange a chair. We lifted her onto a stretcher and rolled her behind a curtain. The paramedics started an intravenous line. I updated Reyes. His answer was a request to begin documenting every symptom and onset time, and to keep crew members separated from passengers as much as possible. The intercom chime in the ceiling sounded twice and then again, which meant an airport operations message. A calm recorded voice announced that out of an abundance of caution, the FAA had issued a ground stop for Atlanta. Flights in the air would land. Departures would hold. Gate screens began to flip from on time to delayed. People stopped mid-step and looked up as if the same thought had moved through them all. The airport is a machine that runs on movement. When it stops, tension collects. I returned to E26 to brief the team. We had 10 patients under observation, 4 requiring oxygen, and 2 agitated enough to require soft restraints to keep them from ripping out intravenous lines. The Miami captain came to the vestibule with the first officer and asked whether his crew could be cleared to rest. I explained that medical supervision was required for everyone who had close contact with symptomatic passengers. He listened and did not argue, which told me he had read the same memos I had about an escalation plan no one had expected to use. An hour later, the lights dimmed for a second and then steadied. Maintenance reported a load transfer. The public address system clicked and delivered a new message, this time from a live voice reading a script from the Airport Emergency Operations Center. The speaker announced that Hartsfield-Jackson was transitioning to a temporary public health containment posture. All passengers were instructed to remain in their current concourses. Food service would remain available. Public safety officers would be present to assist. It was careful, practiced language. No mention of quarantine, just a phrase that meant the same thing. Monroe met me with one of her officers at the rope line. She needed to know whether we would be moving patients out to the clinic or holding them where they were. I told her our current hot zone was sufficient for now. She told me there were crowds at several gates where passengers were demanding to rebook or to leave the building. She tapped her radio and said the volume of calls had tripled in 20 minutes. I asked for 2 more TSA personnel to help keep the area controlled. She shook her head and said she was already pushing her numbers. We made a compromise, 1 additional officer now, and a second as soon as she could free someone from a bottleneck at the Concourse E security checkpoint. We were drawing blood, running rapid tests, and collecting nasopharyngeal swabs for CDC transport when the first report of a bite came through on the radio. The channel went silent for 1 long second, the kind of silence that means everyone has stopped breathing. The report originated at the customs corridor, where the Houston flight had unloaded. A paramedic had been assisting a man who was disoriented and trying to get past the cordon when the man lunged forward and clamped down on the paramedic's forearm. The officer on scene said the man's jaw did not relax easily. The paramedic was stable. The patient was restrained and transferred to a secondary holding area. It was the first time I heard the word bite on the air that night. I remember thinking that it was a word we usually hear from dog incidents or panic attacks. Not like this. 15 minutes later, that same paramedic showed up at our door with a dressing on her arm and a pale face. She insisted she felt fine. I insisted she sit down. We logged the incident and moved her to an observation cot. She tried to answer my questions without looking at the bandage. I did not press. I ordered a dose of prophylactic antibiotics as per our exposure protocol, knowing this was not about bacteria but needing to do something while the rest of our checklist came up short. The next hour blurred into tasks and decisions. Angela moved among our teams the way a conductor moves through an orchestra, steadying a tempo that wanted to speed into chaos. CDC staff rolled out more plastic barriers. We ran out of pulse oximeters and borrowed 3 from the clinic. The HEPA units hummed constantly. We rotated staff out of the hot zone every 40 minutes before fatigue could make small mistakes into large ones. Then, the FAA order changed from a ground stop to a full halt. The tower switched to emergency frequencies and began sequencing inbound aircraft for the last allowed landings. Airport operations closed access doors between concourses and locked them with security magnets. TSA posted additional officers at each door. The loudspeakers continued with messages that sounded reassuring when you heard them once and threatening when you heard them more than that. Overhead, I could hear the faint thump of rotors as heavy transport helicopters passed toward Dobbins Air Reserve Base. On one of our monitors, a live feed from a ramp camera showed buses lining up along a maintenance road with escort vehicles. This was not a drill. We had crossed the line where drills end and plans begin. I left E26 for the first time in hours to check the secondary screening area near the customs hall. The corridor was wide, high-ceilinged, and bright, with a sheen that made it look like a museum. It was crowded and tense. Passengers sat in clusters, heads down, shoulders touching, luggage pulled close. The CDC team had established another set of plastic vestibules and HEPA units. A man in a sports jacket stood at the rope and argued with a public health officer, asking to see his lawyers. A child cried into a blanket that matched her travel pillow. I saw fear move through the crowd like a shimmer, not in screams, but in the way people held still. I found Reyes by a mobile cart, writing case numbers next to times and notes like ataxia, involuntary grasp, and staring episodes. He did not look up when he spoke. He said the proportion of passengers with agitation had increased compared with the Miami flight, and 2 people had to be held down while a sedative was administered. One of them had not calmed fully even with the medication. I asked whether we had lab results yet. He shook his head. He had an answer from the central team that samples were in process and a request to keep documenting. He asked me whether we had seen a change in symptoms after a specific period. I told him most of our patients had progressed over a few hours from fever and headache to confusion and motor symptoms. He nodded like he had expected that answer. we were interrupted by the sound of a radio transmission from the airport police channel. The dispatcher calmly requested units to the Concourse A-B connector due to a disturbance. Then a second call to the Concourse C food court. Then a third to the central atrium near the plane train escalators. Each call included a phrase I had never heard used this many times in 1 hour: crowd control assistance. The police officers on duty moved as fast as they could. It was not enough. I returned to E26 with a maintenance supervisor named Tillman, who had been asked to prioritize power to our HEPA units if the building switched to generator. He wore a high-visibility vest and carried a laminated map of electrical panels. He told me, quietly, that the airport was preparing for load shedding due to spikes across multiple concourses. He had 8 electricians on rotation and 5 more on call. He had worked this building for 20 years. He was calm in the quiet way people are calm when they know every panel and hinge in a place. I liked him immediately for the competence he carried into the room. While I briefed Tillman and his team on our power requirements, a commotion rose from the waiting area outside our rope. A group of travelers had gathered at the concourse door and were pushing against the magnet lock. 2 TSA officers held the line and tried to persuade them to back away. Another group at the other end of the corridor began banging on a shuttered shop's metal gate. We heard a sharp, loud pop from a distant hallway. At first, I thought it was an electrical panel. Then the radio confirmed a warning shot fired in the air at the Concourse C atrium to stop a surge down the escalators. Monroe stood at my elbow again, face set, and told me in a low voice that the Georgia National Guard Military Police Detachment was deploying inside the terminal. She looked like she did not want to be saying that, but the truth of it spread in minutes. Soldiers in military police markings began to appear at choke points, wearing protective vests and helmets, carrying riot shields and M4 carbines with magazine couplers and weapon lights. They moved methodically, pairing with airport police officers to secure stairwells and doors. They were careful with their words and careful with their posture. Calm spreads as surely as panic does. For a little while, the presence of uniforms calmed people. That calm ended when our bitten paramedic stood up. Her name was Yasmin. She had been alert, talking, and refusing to rest. I had checked her forearm and changed the dressing. The bite marks were intact through gauze, the skin around them tense. She had no fever at first. Then she did. She sipped water and joked about getting back to work. I had told her she was off duty. Our paramedic, Miller, sat near her cot recording vitals and shift times. As I turned to check a monitor on another patient, Yasmin made a sound that was not a word. It was a low, hard exhale. She stood quickly and reached for the rail of her cot. I stepped toward her. She backed away and then came forward with speed that did not match the way she had been moving. Miller stepped between us, hands up, saying her name. She moved past him as if he were not there. I took 2 quick steps and caught her shoulders. Her eyes were unfocused. Her grip on my sleeve was intense. It was not a decision. It was a reflex. I called for help. 2 EMTs and the TSA officer nearest our rope line came into the hot zone in one motion. We followed the protocol we use to protect patients and staff during severe agitation. Secure the limbs, avoid chest compression, stabilize the head, and administer a measured dose of sedative. She fought with a force that did not match her size. We secured her to the stretcher with soft restraints, and Miller pushed the medication. She did not calm as quickly as expected. Her muscles held a coiled tension like a wire. The movement outside our rope changed. People had been crowding forward to watch. Now they pulled back. I heard someone say clearly, "It spreads fast." The words moved along the line faster than I could. Reyes stepped on my right, already documenting the progression. He issued a request over the liaison channel for any directive regarding staff exposures that were not responding to medication. No directive came. Everyone was doing their best. No one had a page in the binder for this exact moment. The first flicker of the lights told me the generators had come online. There was a half-second pause in the background hum, and then the sound changed, as if the building had shifted its breath. Tillman's radio cracked with crosstalk from electrical teams calling out panel numbers and amperage limits. "Priority loads stay hot," he said to me without prompting, and then moved toward an access door with his keys. He handed a smaller ring of keys to a younger electrician named Jared and told him to meet him at the Concourse sub-panel. I told Tillman I needed the HEPA units steady. He told me I would have them. The loudspeakers chimed again. A recorded CDC message began looping in a calm female voice. "Please remain in your current location. Public health teams are present to assist. For your safety, do not crowd escalators or doorways. Remain with your party. Help is available." It repeated with precise timing. People started repeating the words along with it, some mocking, most simply listening, as if memorizing the cadence could make it true. Another call came over the police channel for assistance at the MARTA station connected to the airport. The report was short. The platform was full, and people were pressing forward against doors that were not opening. The request for help was urgent. I stood still with my radio quiet, knowing I could not leave where I was needed and wishing I could. The airport is large. Power and radio waves make it feel small. That night it felt large again. We had to move. The clinic had reached capacity, and the concourse was filling with people who wanted answers. The plan we had discussed in the operations meeting took full shape. We would consolidate our patients into a controlled corridor and move toward the service tunnels. If we could get into the plane train tunnels and baggage system service routes, we could navigate under the crowds and reach a service exit near the fire station. From there, ground operations vehicles could shuttle us to a safer perimeter. The plan sounded clean on paper. The space under the airport is a maze known best by people who spend their days there. We needed guides. That is when I met the electrician who became our pathfinder. Tillman sent him to us because he knew the tunnels better than anyone on his team. His name was Aaron Pike. He wore a hard hat, a vest with reflective strips, and a flashlight clipped to his chest. He carried a binder with floor plans that looked like a book he had read 100 times. He had the low, steady voice of someone who had dealt with everything from burst pipes to runaway baggage belts during holiday storms. He looked at our group and the stretchers and did not flinch. He asked 2 questions about our patient's ability to tolerate movement, and then said, "Follow me and stay tight." The second guide came from TSA. Monroe assigned an officer named Diaz to us. Diaz had a compact build and a sweep of hair he kept trying to brush back out of habit despite his helmet. He had worked airport security for 8 years and knew every emergency door that was supposed to stay closed and every one that sometimes did not. He carried a baton and a radio with an earpiece. He spoke little. He watched everything. He checked corners before we reached them. The third came from the airline. Delta's station manager contacted the pilot of a wide-body aircraft that had been offloaded and canceled. The pilot, a senior captain named Charles Benton, had led evacuations before during mechanical incidents and weather. He joined us because he could talk to ground control when no one else could. He wore his uniform jacket, now unbuttoned and dusty, and carried a small flight bag with a handheld aviation radio. He had the practiced tone of a person used to speaking on the air with control towers, calm and clipped, never wasting a word. We built our group quickly. Me, our paramedic Miller, 2 EMTs, Angela, the CDC liaison Reyes, the electrician Aaron, TSA officer Diaz, Captain Benton, and 11 passengers and crew we had triaged as stable but still in need of supervision. We had 2 stretchers, one of them carrying Yasmin, still restrained but now less forceful, her eyes open and unfocused. We had a second stretcher for a man from the Miami flight whose oxygen levels dipped when he stood up. We secured portable oxygen tanks with straps and checked the flow meters twice. I divided the passengers into pairs and placed a staff member at the front and rear of the line. Angela carried our medication bag. I carried airway gear and a small suction device. I reviewed the plan aloud in simple sentences. I did not say anything about the parts I could not control. We moved through a service door next to E26 Diaz's badge, opened it with a beep that sounded too loud, and entered a concrete corridor lined with electrical conduit and maintenance carts. The air was cooler and smelled of dust and machine oil. The sound of the concourse damped behind us, replaced by the white noise of ventilation and the distant rumble of trains. Aaron led us with the assurance of someone walking from one known point to another. He named the doors as we passed them as if to confirm his mental map aloud. Panel room, custodial supply, baggage access hatch. We took a right turn and then a left into a corridor that dropped in a gentle slope. We reached a steel door marked, "Plane train service authorized personnel only." Diaz swiped his badge. The lock clicked. He shouldered it open and checked the space beyond. The plane train tunnels are wide concrete tubes with tracks in the center and a maintenance walkway along the side. The public never sees them without the trains. With the trains paused, the tunnel felt like a long road with rails framing the middle. Emergency lights glowed at intervals, throwing pools of white light and leaving stretches of shadow between. Our footsteps echoed. The patients on stretchers rattled gently. I kept a hand on Yasmin's shoulder. She was warm, not yet burning with fever, and she looked through me the way people do when they are thinking of something behind your face. We moved north under the concourses, passing doors that would have opened into the public platform areas above if they had been unlocked. We could hear muffled sound through the walls. Announcements, the heavy cadence of feet, the call and response of crowd control. Once, we heard a metallic clatter that made us stop until it was quiet again. Aaron kept us at a steady pace. He did not hurry. He did not slow unless we had to navigate around a maintenance cart or a stack of signal equipment. At the junction, under the central atrium, we met our first obstacle. A security gate that should have been open for maintenance traffic was down, its frame locked to the concrete floor. Aaron cursed softly and examined the mount. The gate was designed to prevent access when trains were moving. With the trains halted, the gate should have been released. Power fluctuations had pulled it shut. Tillman's voice came over Aaron's radio twice in quick sequence, asking for locations and panel numbers. Aaron answered with a string of codes that sounded like coordinates. Tillman told him which subpanel might release the lock and which breaker he had already thrown. They were working the same puzzle from 2 ends of the maze. While Aaron knelt by the lock housing, Diaz scanned the shadows behind us. Captain Benton stood near the track and raised his handheld radio to his mouth, requesting a status update from ground control. The ground controller on the other end sounded young and strained. He reported that the field was closing to all civilian movements except emergency. A C-17 transport had been cleared to depart. A smaller medevac was holding short. Fire crews were on scene for an unrelated incident at the far end of the field. Benton thanked him and kept the radio on his shoulder, listening. We heard the first faraway shouts through the maintenance door at our right. Then hands pounded the other side of the door in quick succession, 4 or 5 in a rhythm that signaled urgency and not coordination. The pounding paused and then returned harder. Diaz approached the door, leaned close without touching it, and said firmly, "Step back from the door." The pounding stopped for 2 seconds and resumed. He stepped back. Aaron called out that he needed 3 more minutes. He had the panel open and a portable battery pack from his kit clipped to the actuator. Tillman's voice came through again with numbers. The lock thumped and released. Aaron stood and pulled the gate up. We slid the stretchers through one at a time, Diaz holding the gate while people passed. The door to our right shook again. A metal sound scraped as if something hard ran down the length of it. We moved on as quickly as we could without losing control of the line. 200 yards later, we reached the access hatch to the baggage belts. The hatch opened to a catwalk above a highway of conveyor belts, some still moving, some stopped and tilted. The space felt like the working heart of the building, all motor and rubber and steel. The belts fed into chutes that carried bags toward the carousels in the public halls. With the power fluctuations, some belts ticked forward in small spurts. We followed Aaron along the catwalk, single file, pushing the stretchers carefully where the metal grating flexed. I kept my eyes on the wheels. I tried not to look down. At a junction, we heard voices below and to the left. A group of ramp workers had gathered near a belt, their high-visibility vests glowing in our headlamps. They were trying to lift an older man whose leg had slipped between 2 belts when the system had surged. He was trapped just above the knee, not bleeding, but unable to move. They called up to us. We could not ignore them. Diaz assessed the scene quickly and pointed to a ladder 2 bays down. Aaron grabbed a tool bag from his kit and descended with Diaz. I handed my airway bag to an EMT, pulled on a pair of thicker gloves and followed. The man's face was clenched, his breath short. The ramp workers had been talking to him, keeping him focused. His name was Victor. He had worked the ramp for years. Aaron examined the guard plates around the belts and found the bolts that would release the cover. Diaz called up to the catwalk for a wedge. One of the EMTs slid a short pry bar down to him. We coordinated the release and turned the belt housing upward enough to free the leg. Victor's pant leg was caught, but his skin was intact. We wrapped the area with a compression bandage to control swelling. He could not place weight on the leg. We arranged a makeshift stretcher from a rolling cart and 2 spare guard planks, secured him, and passed him up to the catwalk with a chain of hands. The ramp workers joined our column without being asked. 2 of them pushed Victor alongside our medical stretcher. I adjusted the oxygen line for the man on our original stretcher and checked Yasmin again. Her breathing had slowed. Her eyes were still fixed on a distance no one else could see. When we reached the far side of the conveyor maze, Aaron guided us down a service staircase and into a corridor that opened onto the airfield through a roll-up door. The door was partially raised already, an emergency release having popped it when the power cycled. The air beyond smelled of jet fuel and smoke. The sky had turned from gray to black. Blue taxiway lights traced lines across the field like a grid. In the distance, flames flickered near an aircraft at the far end of a runway. The harsh white flashes of airport fire rescue vehicles strobed against the fuselage. We heard a deep, steady jet engine rumble, distinct from the smaller aircraft, and then saw it. A C-17 heavy transport rolling, lights bright, lifting its nose and climbing away into the night. It rose slowly, heavily, and then disappeared into cloud. An airport operations supervisor in a pickup waved us forward with quick motions. He had been listening for us on the radio. He pointed to the airfield fire station at the edge of the ramp. He said we needed to move now, because a group was moving along the fence line toward the same exit. He did not know if they were evacuees or something else. He did not say the word I was thinking. He looked at our stretchers and made a series of decisions in half a second that saved us 10 minutes. He told 2 of his crew to grab an Oshkosh Striker 3000 from the bay and bring it around to the service road. The fire captain on duty, a woman with lines in her face like someone who had smiled through engines and long summers, told me they could escort us to the outer gate and break it open if it failed to cycle. We made for the fire station in a tight column, heads on a swivel, the sound of our wheels lost under the wider noise of the field. Diaz walked point, baton in one hand, radio in the other. Monroe's voice threaded through the radio with updates from inside. Concourse doors holding for now. Another surge at the MARTA station. Additional National Guard units moving to the central atrium. She sounded like she would stay at her post until the floor fell out from under her. I took a steadying breath and kept moving. Inside the fire station, the smell of diesel and hydraulic fluid wrapped around us. The bay doors were open. The Oshkosh Stryker 3000 stood ready, tall and purposeful, with its turret and bumper nozzle and banks of scene lights. A firefighter climbed into the driver's seat and flipped on the light bars. Another crew member secured us onto the rear step and side platforms designed for rapid response, not for passengers, but tonight there were no standard uses for anything. Captain Benton coordinated with ground control for a clear path along the service road. The controller acknowledged but sounded distracted by multiple priorities calling at once. We rolled. The Stryker moved with surprising speed along the perimeter road, its lights cutting a clear path through the dark. We approached the service gate that would lead us to the outer road. The gate should have opened at the tap of a badge. It did not. Power had cycled again. The lock stayed shut. The firefighter did not hesitate. He positioned the Stryker square to the gate, tested the gate with a bump to gauge resistance, and then advanced with steady pressure. The heavy vehicle pushed the galvanized steel mesh inward until the lock housing bent and the hinges popped one by one. The gate folded and then gave way completely, falling inward with a hollow clap. The driver pulled through and swung wide, making room for the operations truck and our group on foot. Diaz signaled us through with the same small motion he used at every door that night. As we crossed the threshold, a group of figures appeared at the end of the service lane, moving quickly, not in lines, not in the staggering way of a tired crowd, but in the short, direct movements I had seen earlier. The firefighter tapped the horn twice, short blasts. The figures did not change their movement. The operations supervisor shouted that we should move now, and that he would take the rear with a pickup. The firefighter and the Stryker covered the lane, lights bright, and the group behind us surged forward. We kept our column tight, the stretchers centered, Victor's makeshift cart between the two EMTs who had become his legs. I felt the long reach of the night behind my shoulder blades and refused to turn. We reached the outer road and merged with a small convoy of airport vehicles and one unmarked sedan. The Stryker took the lead, clearing the path. The operations pickup brought up the rear. We moved along the perimeter toward an interchange that would lead to the loop highway. In the distance, I could see headlights backed up along an on-ramp, people standing outside their cars, red tail lights stacked in a ribbon that curved out of sight. My radio hissed. A voice from a civil defense channel announced that the Atlanta containment plan was no longer active. Units were to fall back to prearranged positions south of the city. Another voice clarified the message. Relocate to Macon. The words were stripped of commentary. The effect did not require any. Our group was quiet. Even the patients were quiet. I checked the oxygen tanks. The first tank was down to a quarter. I switched the line to a fresh tank, cracking the valve open smoothly and watching the needle swing. I checked Yasmin's restraints and her pulse. Her skin was cool again. Her gaze focused for the first time in an hour and landed on my face. She said my name in a voice that sounded like hers. Then she closed her eyes and slept. I stood still and let it land. The outer road joined the access road, which joined a feeder to the interstate. Emergency vehicles sat at angles designed to slow traffic without blocking it. A National Guard Humvee idled with a soldier standing behind a shield at the median. He did not raise his rifle. He raised his hand and signaled us forward. A police cruiser pointed us toward the lane reserved for emergency traffic. The striker led us onto the interstate shoulder, moving at a measured speed that matched the center lane's slow crawl. The ramp behind us filled with vehicles in minutes. The field of red lights looked like a chain that had no end. The emergency broadcast tone sounded again on the radio, short, then long, then short. The recorded voice was clinical and unwavering. Atlanta quarantine zone breached. All units fall back to Macon. It repeated with the same cadence. Benton lowered his handheld and looked straight ahead. Diaz sat on the striker's step with his head against the rail, eyes closed for 3 seconds and then open again. Aaron checked his tool bag as if he were tallying the pieces of his day and found them all there. Angela rubbed her forehead with the heel of her hand and then looked at me, a question without words. I nodded once. It was not permission and not a plan. It was the only answer I had. We continued south on the interstate shoulder, moving past stopped cars, people standing outside their vehicles with doors open, children in back seats holding stuffed animals, a couple holding hands between lanes as if the space between them were safer than the space ahead. The striker's siren was off. Its lights were sufficient to clear a path. We drove at the speed you drive when you cannot go fast and must not go slow. At a cloverleaf, the convoy turned off toward a state route that would eventually bypass the most clogged segments. The operations supervisor's pickup peeled away to return to the airport. He leaned out his window and raised a hand. I raised mine. There was nothing to say over the engine noise in the night, and nobody needed words. The firefighter and the striker asked us to hold on as we cleared a set of rumble strips. We did. The radio carried snippets of traffic from police and guard units describing closures, detours, requests for medical support. The words were familiar and wrong in context, the way normal language sounds when the circumstances have shifted beyond normal. We made a brief stop at a county fire station to exchange the striker for a smaller engine that would be easier to maneuver on 2-lane roads. The county chief there had a map spread out on the hood of a vehicle and a pencil in his hand. He looked like he had been awake for 30 hours and would stay awake for 30 more. He gave us water bottles and directions, and a portable radio programmed to his frequency. He asked if we could take 3 more people who had come in from the airport on foot and were headed south. We made room. There's always room when the alternative is leaving someone behind. Back on the road, I took the middle bench inside the smaller engine cabin and looked out the windshield. The night had thinned to a deep blue at the horizon. The dashboard clock read 1:40 a.m. I thought about the Miami flight, the Houston flight, E-26, the plastic barrier with the magnet seals, the HEPA units humming full-time, the faces of people at the rope line, the looping voice from the ceiling asking everyone to remain calm. I thought about the long tunnels under the airport and the way sound carries in concrete. I thought about the way Yasmin had said my name and then slept. I tried to imagine the moment the loudspeakers would stop. I did not find that moment. I focused on the next 10 minutes and then the next. We reached a distribution warehouse complex on the outskirts where the county had staged fuel and bottled water during previous storms. The site had lights powered by generators and a line of vehicles idling with local plates and out-of-state plates together. Volunteers in reflective vests handed out cases with practiced efficiency. A sheriff's deputy directed traffic with a light wand. A sign handwritten on cardboard said, "Water 2 per car." It was steady, organized, and quiet. Every disaster needs islands of order. We stopped long enough to refill our water and to pick up 2 extra oxygen tanks from a medical supply truck. I exchanged a look with the driver, a man who had probably delivered oxygen concentrators to homes for years. He did not ask for paperwork. He handed me the tanks and a simple, "Be safe." We continued south. As the interstate opened slightly, the convoy shifted lanes and increased speed. Miles passed with the rhythm of tires on concrete expansion joints. The radio traffic thinned. We had left the densest knot behind. The sky lightened a little more at the eastern edge. I felt the ache of a long shift settle into my shoulders. An ache that tells you that you are still functioning, still upright, still making decisions. I looked over at the crew and our passengers. Victor rested on the stretcher with his leg elevated, eyes open, watching the ceiling as if it were a map. The man from the Miami flight with the oxygen cannula slept with his mouth slightly open but breathing evenly. The two ramp workers who had pushed his stretcher earlier were asleep sitting up, heads tilted at matching angles. Diaz had his radio against his chest and his eyes half closed, opening every few seconds in the half-sleep of someone who will wake before anyone needs to say his name. Aaron flipped through his binder as if the act of looking at lines and boxes could hold a door closed in his head. Benton stared forward with an expression I had seen on pilots' faces before, when schedules unraveled and they had to be the stable point for a cabin full of strangers. Angela took inventory of our medications once more and then set the bag at her feet. I thought of the airport again, of the immense building that cradles movement for a city and a region and the world. I thought of the way it had not failed so much as been asked to do something it was never designed to do, hold people in. Airports are gates, not walls. The difference matters. We had tried to make it a wall for a day. It had held as long as walls made of announcements and plastic can hold. Then it had become a gate again, and we had chosen to pass through. By the time we reached the outskirts of Macon, the broadcast had changed. It no longer referenced a quarantine. It referenced coordination points, shelter sites, and medical stations. It named highways by number and exits by mile marker. It spoke of meals ready for distribution at certain hours and of ways to contact loved ones through centralized message boards. The voice was still the same calm voice we had heard in the ceiling hours ago. It had traded one script for another. We checked in with the incident command post staged at a civic center with a broad parking lot. The parking lines were full of vehicles arranged like scales on a fish. Volunteers in vests layered over jackets directed incoming groups to color-coded zones. Inside, folding tables became registration, triage, and sleeping areas. A public health nurse took our names, our roles, and our exposure statuses. She looked at Yasmin's chart with careful eyes and spoke to me in a side room. We discussed isolation and observation, staffing limits, and the need for consistent data collection. She did not use words like unknown, and yet they were present in everything we said. We made a plan for the next 6 hours that did not pretend to be a plan for the next 6 days. I stayed with our group as they were assigned a space along a wall. I made sure the oxygen tanks were full and the monitors functioning. I wrote notes that looked like all the notes I had written in hospitals for years. Time, heart rate, oxygen saturation, temperature, symptoms. The act of writing pulled the large world into the small one where we were. It was a way of insisting that attention to detail still mattered. When the first light of morning found the edges of the parking lot, I stepped outside and stood near the edge of a row of cars. The air was cooler than it had been at night. I could hear birds under the sound of generators and voices. A National Guard truck rolled past slowly and parked near the entrance. A line of people formed calmly behind a table where volunteers handed out breakfast packs. A child laughed at something her father said. On the far side of the lot, a group of firefighters stacked cases of water and then sat on one of the cases and looked at their hands. My radio cracked once with a faint signal from Atlanta. The voice was unreadable, a mix of static and distant metal. I turned the volume down and then up, as if that would fine-tune the distance between two different worlds. I clipped the radio back to my vest. Inside the Civic Center, the day began again. Not like any day I had known, but like a day nonetheless. I returned to our group, checked vitals, adjusted medications, and spoke with the logistics coordinator about supplies. I talked to Diaz about whether he wanted to try to contact his partner. I checked on Aaron and asked him to help the incident command with power mapping for the building. I asked Benton to coordinate with the aviation volunteers who were setting up a message board for stranded crews. I asked Angela to organize a rotation for our team so we could rest without leaving our patients alone. She nodded once, as if we had made that plan a year ago. Yasmin woke. She blinked and looked at me without confusion. Her temperature had dropped. Her pulse had steadied. She asked for water. I handed it to her and told her she had frightened us earlier. She grimaced and said that she had frightened herself. We spoke about what she remembered. It came in pieces. A tightness in her hands, a tunnel in her vision. A sense of wanting to move toward a point that kept moving away. No images, just pressure. I recorded her words carefully. I knew they would matter, not only to her. By late morning, the incident command had assigned our small group a designation and a set of tasks. We were now a mobile medical unit with a logistics support pair, a security liaison, and an aviation communication advisor. The titles were improvised and precise, a way of turning a column of people who had fled a building into a team that could help others. We took on a list of priorities. Stabilize our patients, help set up isolation areas for those arriving with fever and confusion, assist in routing critical cases to a hospital that still had bed space, prepare basic instructions for volunteers on how to use protective equipment and, if possible, call back to Hartsfield-Jackson to coordinate any further evacuations through secured corridors should that become possible. In the hours that followed, we did the work that needs doing after the hardest part of a night. We took temperatures and blood pressures. We showed people how to fit in 95 respirators without crushing the nose bridge. We held the hands of those whose family members had not arrived and showed them where the message board was. We spoke to a guard sergeant about escorting a short convoy of medical supplies from a warehouse. We rested in chairs for 14 minutes at a time with our radios on the lowest volume that would still wake us. When I finally found a moment to sit with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, I allowed myself to look backward. I saw the arrival gate, the plastic curtain, the magnet seals that snapped shut like a book, the HEPA units with their steady hum, the faces of passengers who watched and waited. I saw the concourse fill and tilt towards panic and then tilt back again under the weight of uniforms and calm voices. I saw a woman I had worked with on dozens of calls stand up out of a sickness that had turned her body into a set of reflexes, and I saw her come back again. I saw an electrician open a gate with a battery pack and a TSA officer stand with his shoulders squared to a door that shook in its frame. I saw a pilot use his radio to give our group a sliver of certainty for 90 seconds at a time. I saw an airport fire crew turn a vehicle meant for foam and water into a bridge through a fence. I saw the runway lights and a transport climbing out. I saw the interstate full of red lights and a calm voice telling the region to move south. People will ask what it was like when the airport became the center of a city's attempt to hold the line. They will ask why the line did not hold. The answer is not dramatic. Airports are built for flow, not for stillness. We used every tool we had to slow a moving thing. For a few hours we did. Then the patterns of movement became larger than the tools. The work now is not to explain that as failure, but to understand it as the handoff from one kind of plan to another. We planned for arrivals and departures. Then we planned for shelters and routes. The names change. The work remains. When I finished the coffee, I stood up and went back to our unit. The day had become the next part of the first night. We had a new list. I read the first 2 lines and started with those. We were going to review the isolation layout, and then we were going to help the volunteers prepare more protective equipment. After that, we were going to check on our patients again. After that, we were going to eat something that could be eaten fast. After that, we were going to make a call to a number in the airport operations log and see who answered. As I adjusted the strap on my vest and picked up my radio, the emergency broadcast tone sounded again over the Civic Center speakers. The same calm voice delivered a new message. Shelter locations confirmed, medical stations operating, supply lines opening, ground movements coordinated. It did not say anything about an end or a beginning. It said what needed to be done next. I clipped the radio to my collar, nodded to Angela, and we began. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.